Hi everybody. My name is Gab. I'm a second year doing a dual degree in Women's and Gender Studies and Information Studies. And I'll be reading my literature review. So it's entitled Feminist Praxis in the Archives, Examining Historical Silences. This paper looks at the ways in which feminist theory informs how archives function as gatekeeping institutions and the ways in which archival practices are connected with historical silences. In particular, I'm interested in how archives function as institutions of capitalism that enact violence against communities of color, and simultaneously how they function as narratives of queer people's lived experiences. What does it mean to subvert hegemonic ideals of record making and center LGBTQ, Black people of color, POC, through stories and firsthand accounts? In this vein, I detail what an archive is and how it can be queered. Traditionally, archives have been centered around upholding and replicating cisgender, heterosexual, white, patriarchal records that maintain and reenact violence against LGBTQ communities of color. I am concerned with problematizing the status quo of record keeping and the ensuing repercussions of recorded lived experiences. Furthermore, I contextualize my theory and methodology using an intersectional lens. How within archives, race, gender, and class relate to systems of power, and how this excludes marginalized identities from the historical record. This paper will focus on the ways in which feminist theory can contribute to a more nuanced understanding of archives that perpetuate systems of power, and how examples of literary narratives can combat this. My eventual aim is to include stories from Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House and Mecca Jamila Sullivan's Blue Talk and Love as a challenge of perspectives of the traditional archive. As these stories begin to fill in the archival silences through narrative form, I also want to understand the implications of merging broader archival practices with typically silenced histories. In other words, by using a feminist lens, how are archives queered through quotidian collection practices and literary endeavors? This literature review only covers the contextualization of a feminist intersectional lens and pertinent issues within archives as a means to a start of a larger project. Because archives have traditionally been met with neutrality, it is crucial to understand how an intersectional lens proves this to be false. As discussed further on, Mario Ramirez refers to the prevalence of objectivity of records. That is, they are not seen as tied to politics or to systems of power. Who decides archival value and what is to be archived should not be seen as objective, for these choices have material consequences. To understand intersectionality better, I would be remiss if I did not mention its founding in Black women's theorization. The Combahee River Collective's pivotal manifesto of interlocking systems of oppression and Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality complicate understandings of systems of power. In the 1970s, a group of Black lesbian feminists known as the Combahee River Collective created a statement in response to the exclusion of Black lesbian women from movements for social justice. They were concerned with creating an anti-racist and anti-sexist politics that did not just favor Black men or white women. Key contributions within the statement argues that a politics centered on Black women's liberation is necessary, that their work must be anti-capitalist and must dismantle patriarchy. This Black feminist statement remains a foundational text, especially as it coincides with Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality. Crenshaw's theory is concerned with various categories of marginalization, not just interacting at the same time, but in coalition. That is, recognizing identity, race, class, gender, etc., not solely in separate categories, but rather in relation to dominant systems of power. In thinking about dominant systems of power, archives may not automatically appear to replicate harmful ideologies, yet they do. In analyzing archives as potentially harmful, it is first imperative to understand what they are and how they function as sites of knowledge production. According to the Society for American Archivists, SAA, the archive refers to permanently valuable records. They are the documentary evidence of past events. They are the facts we use to interpret and understand history, end quote. Although this description is generic, archives have grown to be understood as more than maintenance of records. In Critical Feminism in the Archives, Marika Seafor and Stacy Wood discuss how feminist praxis informs archival theory and practice. They trace how the archive has come to have various meanings such as, quote, research site, theoretical concept, and object of inquiry, end quote. They note that the phrase archival turn represents the archive as institution and the, quote, construction of power within and around the archive, end quote. It is not enough to say that archives are spaces of power. It is recognizing what has led to this and to whose expense archives have become exclusionary. Along with constructions of power and exclusionary spaces is the way history is recounted through archives. Because archives are repositories of information, this becomes part of the fabric of preserving history, which is a political enterprise. The institution of archive then can become worthy of analysis. Because archival turn has become embedded in critical feminist theory, the definition of archive has expanded and is, quote, understood as a universal metaphor for memory structures, information storage, and knowledge production, end quote. This in turn allows the perception of the archive to be troubled, exposing nuances between technical practices and more conceptual or theoretical practices. Herein, I hope to include a literary analysis that complicates the archival turn. Keeping in mind the archival turn, I consider the implications of daily practices within the profession and the consequences of maintaining the status quo or opposing them. In Being Assumed Not to Be, a critique of whiteness as an archival imperative, Mario Ramirez situates practices from an information studies perspective and critiques the field of archiving as privileging whiteness within collections. That being said, however, Ramirez's article does not include an intersectional analysis and chooses to focus solely on racial issues within archives. Ramirez slightly alludes to gender by indicating a statistic that points to the archival field as increasingly being dominated by white women, yet is not inclusive of Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, and other marginalized groups. With that said, by integrating critical race theory, his analysis could still be useful in understanding supposed objectivity within archives. He indicates how maintaining neutrality within the field undermines the work towards diversity and inclusion. Archivists not only have to be conscious of what they are collecting, but how this informs oppressive power structures. By examining the archival profession, Ramirez notes, for example, how the SAA continues to perpetuate a harmful hierarchy of privileging whiteness. In one instance, the SAA continued to neglect diversity and racial equity until it faced backlash and eventually included diversity as a main goal within its strategic plan. Although including diversity initiatives at the start, it is not enough. Ramirez argues whiteness and masculinity remain privileged. In order to undo this, there needs to be a self-reflexivity or a reckoning of unfair practices within archives themselves and the biases that replicate white male privilege. Ramirez's Being Assumed Not to Be will be useful in thinking of contesting privileging whiteness. However, an analysis of intersectionality will further a feminist framework that is more inclusive of gender and other identities. Furthermore, it'll be useful to think of the ways in which collection practices do not remain objective, rather that they become intentional in who selects these records and which ones they select, particularly surrounding LGBTQ Black POC narratives. Tanya Sutherland's analysis on how archives have preserved and reproduced white narratives is particularly important, as she centers archival violence against Black communities. In Sutherland's Archival Amnesty in Search of Black American Transitional and Restorative Justice, she integrates a pertinent analysis on Black lives within archives. Her article examines the ways in which archives have excluded records of lynchings and in modern day how depictions of violence against Black people, or what she terms Black death, are not included in the archive, even though violence is enacted so heavily on Black communities. She argues the elision of violence against Black communities and the lack of consequences for these harmful practices equates to amnesty within the archive. Sutherland begins by tracing amnesty given by President Andrew Johnson to all white men who fought for the Confederacy as having no legal repercussions for enslaving Black people, to lynchings that were purposefully not recorded within the archival record. Essentially, the amnesty given to perpetrators of violence during and after the Civil War has extended to archivists that have continued to lack an engagement of justice for Black Americans. Sutherland states, quote, "Archives are spaces rich with tacit narratives of power and knowledge, of narratives that have been constructed by archival theory and that continue to be reinforced by archival practice," end quote. Notably, Sutherland contends records of violence may re-inflict trauma. However, she indicates Marika's in LGBTQ histories as a counterpoint. C4 asserts hate crimes and examining hatred can be useful for dismantling power structures. Sutherland recognizes how this analysis can be applied with Black communities and violence. Ultimately, unless a specifically anti-racist and critical archival framework is implemented, archives will continue to perpetuate the intentional amnesty given to perpetrators of violence against Black communities. This analysis is useful in explicitly implementing Black feminist theory and anti-racist work within archives. In conclusion, I have sought to undergird my analysis of archives within a framework of intersectionality. As I have outlined, archives have functioned as gatekeeping institutions, primarily to store, preserve, and disseminate information. However, they have not always accounted for marginalized histories. It is imperative that I include a feminist analysis to propose a framework that troubles the institutional aspect of archives. Although archives have traditionally functioned as exclusionary institutions via the proliferation of racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., they can subvert this by legitimizing forms of knowledge that stem from non-normative sources, such as queer literary narratives, and through intentional feminist praxis. Thank you.